Last October, my son walked into my piano tuning shop with a lawyer and said, "A blind girl doesn't need a shaking old man. Sign the papers or lose everything." He saw a helpless old man in a room full of silent instruments. He did not know that every piano in that shop had been listening, and his blind daughter had spent 2 years tuning the trap that would destroy him. I am so grateful you are here with me today. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you are watching from. I read every single one. A small note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for educational and entertainment purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is coincidental. But everything it asks you to feel is entirely intentional. The last quiet morning. Some mornings, my piano shop feels less like a business and more like the inside of a held breath. The Vermont fog sits low against the front windows. The amber lamp throws a warm circle across the old maple counter, and the smell of wood polish mixed with rosin and damp autumn air creates something I have never found the right word for, only that when I breathe it in, I know I am exactly where I belong. That morning, Elise was at the tuning bench near the back wall, with her hands resting on the exposed strings of an upright piano a customer had brought in the week before. She was 15, small for her age, dark hair pulled into a single braid so it would not brush against the soundboard while she worked. Her eyes, pale gray and very still, looked at nothing and everything at once. Elise had been legally blind since birth. Her world was not built from light. It was built from sound. Her fingers moved across the piano wire the way most people move their eyes across a page. She pressed a key, let the note ring, then tilted her head and listened to it decay, with a focus so complete it made the rest of the room feel like an interruption. "The A above middle C is 2 cents flat," she said without turning her head. Not enough for most ears to catch, but it is pulling the whole temperament off center. I checked the electronic tuner on my workbench. She was right. It had taken me nearly 40 years to develop an ear that could detect a 2-cent deviation. Elise had arrived at it by the time she was 12, using nothing but the instrument she was born with. I sat across the room pretending to review the service log, but really just listening to her work. It was a habit I had kept for years, without admitting it. Listening to Elise work was like checking to make sure the world was still in tune. 6 years. I had been raising her in this small shop on the Vermont coast for 6 years, and I still found myself surprised by the way she filled a room without taking up much space in it. She was not loud. She did not demand things. She never complained about growing up in a piano repair shop instead of a normal house with a backyard and friends down the street. She listened. She learned. She worked. Moving at her own pace, which I had come to understand was the only pace in this shop that kept perfect time. Her blindness had never touched her mind. Only her eyes had declined to participate. Everything else, her hearing, her memory, her quiet and relentless intelligence, operated at a level I had stopped trying to measure and simply learned to trust. I was thinking about that when she set her tuning lever down. She did not hesitate. She placed it on the felt cloth with the deliberate care of someone who has just received new information, tilted her head toward the front of the shop, and stood. "Someone is coming," she said. 2 people. One favors the left heel. The other is wearing hard-soled shoes. Expensive ones. She walked into the back room before I could respond. The entire thing took fewer than 5 seconds. The front door had not yet opened. I did not have time to ask why before I saw who was standing in the doorway. Marcus Calloway. My son. He stepped inside wearing a smile I recognized from when he was a boy and had come home past curfew with a story already prepared. That smile had once made me believe everything was fine. Now, seeing it for the first time in 6 years, I noticed what I had always failed to hear. It was pitched in the wrong key. It had never once been in tune. Marcus was 44 now. Gray had settled at both temples, and his face carried lines that did not come from laughter. He wore a good coat and polished shoes, but there was something in the way he held his shoulders, too rigid, too composed, that told me the outside was working hard to hold the inside together. Standing half a step behind him was a woman I had never seen. Dark hair cut at the jaw, a charcoal blazer, a slim leather briefcase in her left hand. Her eyes made one efficient pass around the room, over the display cases, along the restored pianos on the far wall, pausing on the Steinway Grand in the center of the showroom, then settling on the door where Elise had just disappeared. It was not the look of someone visiting a family home. It was the look of someone calculating the value of what stood in front of her. "Dad," Marcus said, his voice warm in a way that sounded rehearsed. "It has been a long time." I stood. My hands trembled, not from emotion, but because 71 years and 5 decades of piano wire had left their mark on my nerves. I had made peace with the trembling. I had not made peace with the man in front of me. "Marcus," I said. Just his name. He looked around with performed nostalgia, reached out, and ran one finger along the rim of the Steinway. "Does it still play?" "It still plays," I said. "Good." He turned and gestured to the woman. "This is Diane. Diane Price. My wife. She is an attorney. Her practice is in Boston." Diane Price extended her hand. The handshake was firm enough to be professional and brief enough to be controlled. The handshake of someone who managed every gesture deliberately. "Hello, Mr. Calloway. Marcus has told me a great deal about you. He has not told me anything about you," I said honestly. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not embarrassment, closer to recalculation. Then, she smiled. Marcus looked around one more time, and his gaze stopped at the back room door. "Where is Elise?" he asked. "I have heard she has been doing some incredible things." I looked at my son directly. "She is studying." He nodded. The smile held, but his eyes moved once more toward that door. And this time, I was certain, that was not the look of a father who had missed his daughter for 6 years. That was the look of a man who had come to collect something with a dollar sign in front of it. The pianos around us held their silence, the way instruments do when a wrong note enters the room. And in that quiet, I understood something I did not want to understand. This visit had nothing to do with family. This was reconnaissance, and the opening measure of something I was not ready to hear had just been played. 3 days after my son's visit, the shop settled back into what looked from the outside like its usual rhythm. The fog came and went. I opened the lid of the Steinway each morning the same way I had for 30 years. But I noticed I had begun sleeping lighter. I was listening to the front door more than I used to, and I no longer sat with my back to the windows. It was the kind of alertness that comes not from knowing what is wrong, but from suspecting that you have just heard the first measure of a piece you do not want to play. Elise was at her Tuesday afternoon tutoring session when the mail carrier knocked. I was alone at the workbench, fitting a new damper felt onto a baby grand action, when I heard the knock and opened the front door. He handed me a large envelope without ceremony, thick, cream-colored, with a return address from a law firm in Boston that took up 3 full lines of print. I set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment before I opened it. The language inside was dense and deliberate, the kind of writing designed to exhaust the reader before they reach the part that actually matters. I read it slowly, moving my finger beneath each line the way my father had taught me to read anything important. It took 2 full passes before I was certain I understood. Marcus was filing a petition with the Vermont Family Court to be appointed Elise's financial guardian. The stated grounds were that Elise, as a minor under 18 with a documented visual disability, lacked the legal capacity to manage assets of significant value. The assets in question were listed precisely: $6 million, derived from the sale of a medical technology patent 8 months prior. I set the papers on the counter and stood very still. $6 million. The number was not what stopped me. I already knew what Elise's patent had sold for. What stopped me was the phrase her father's attorneys had chosen: visual disability rendering the minor unable to exercise sound financial judgment. They were using her blindness. a condition that affected her eyes and nothing else. A condition that had no connection whatsoever to how she thought or reasoned or made decisions, and they had built a legal argument on top of it the way someone builds a house on a foundation that does not belong to them. In the United States, legal blindness is defined as visual acuity of 20/200 or less in the better eye with best correction. It is a measurement of sight. It says nothing about intelligence, judgment, or the capacity to understand complex financial instruments. But the petition had been written to blur that distinction, to plant in a judge's mind the image of a helpless child who could not possibly manage her own affairs. I was still standing at the counter when I heard the back door open. Elise came in from the side entrance she always used, dropped her bag on the chair by the door, and was halfway to the kitchen before she stopped. She did not see my face. She heard it. Something in the quality of my breathing, or the particular silence I was carrying, told her everything she needed to know. "They sent it already," she said. "It was not a question. You knew this was coming." She crossed the room, pulled out the stool across from me, and sat down. From her bag she removed a thin manila folder and placed it on the counter between us. She did it carefully, the way she handled a fragile mechanism on the tuning bench. Deliberate. No wasted movement. "I have known something like this was coming for 2 years, she said. I did not know exactly when. I opened the folder. Inside were documents I recognized immediately. A trust agreement, properly formatted, bearing my own signature on the last page. I had signed it 8 months earlier. The afternoon Elise had brought me the papers and explained that it was a protective structure for the patent proceeds. I had read the summary she prepared, asked a few questions, and signed where she indicated. I had trusted her judgment the way I always did. What I had not fully understood until this moment was how precisely she had used that arrangement. "I set up the trust through a Burlington attorney 8 months ago," Elise said. Her voice carried the same steady tone she used when describing a mechanical problem. Factual. No particular emotion attached to the words themselves. "I asked you to sign as my guardian, because I am not old enough to execute the documents myself. The trust protects the patent, proceeds from any third-party claim, including a guardianship petition." She paused to let me absorb it. "If a court appoints a financial guardian for me, that guardian manages my personal finances. But they cannot touch assets already held inside a properly structured, irrevocable trust. The trust exists as a separate legal entity. It is beyond the reach of a guardianship order. In the United States, an irrevocable trust is a legal arrangement in which the person who creates it permanently gives up the right to modify or revoke it. Once assets are placed inside, they belong to the trust, not to any individual. A court-appointed guardian can manage a minor's personal bank accounts or daily expenses, but they cannot access, redirect, or dissolve assets held within an irrevocable trust that was properly established before the guardianship petition was filed. Elise had built the wall before her father had even picked up the hammer. I looked at my signature on the last page of the trust document. My own handwriting. 8 months old. "You planned this before Marcus even contacted us," I said. "I found his bankruptcy filings on Pacer when I was 13, she said. She said it the way she described a pitch deviation. A fact, a measurement. Something she had verified and moved on from. Pacer is the federal court's public access system. Anyone can search it. My screen reader converted every filing into audio. I listened to all of them. He had been through 2 Chapter 7 liquidations in 3 years. I started watching his financial activity after that. When the patent sold, I knew it was only a matter of time. You were 13 years old. I was worried about you, she said simply. You would not have fought this on your own. You would have tried to find a way to keep the peace. I did not answer, because she was right. I looked at her hands resting flat on the counter. Small hands. Steady. The same hands that had tuned a piano that morning, with more precision than most professionals I had known in 40 years. The same hands that had apparently been constructing a legal defense for 2 years without telling me. I thought about Sarah then. Elise's mother. The woman who had brought this child to my door on a rainy night 6 years ago, with a look in her eyes that I had chosen for 6 years not to examine too closely. 1 week after she left Elise with me, Sarah was dead. Prescription medication. Case closed. I had accepted that. I had told myself it was the only thing I could do. Elise, I said. Yes. I looked at the trust documents. Then at her. We will talk more tonight. But first, are there other things you have not told me? She held my gaze for a moment. Or rather, she held the direction of my voice, which for Elise was the same thing. Yes, she said. But one thing at a time, Grandpa. And for the first time in 6 years, sitting across from my 15-year-old granddaughter who had been quietly preparing for this moment since she was 13, I allowed myself to wonder whether Sarah had been right to be afraid, and whether I had been wrong about everything I had told myself since the night she walked out into the rain and never came back. After Elise went to bed that night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I did not drink, and the trust documents spread in front of me that I was no longer reading. The lamp above the table made a small circle of yellow light. Outside, Lake Champlain pushed against the rocks the way it always did after dark, steady and indifferent, older than anything either of us was dealing with. I had told Elise we would talk more. But sitting alone in the kitchen, I found that the conversation I needed to have was not with her. It was with myself. Specifically, with the version of myself that had spent 6 years choosing not to ask certain questions. The memory came back the way it always did when I let my guard down. Not gradually, but all at once, like a piano string wound past its breaking point, finally letting go with a sound you feel in your chest before you hear it. It was November of 2019. Nearly midnight. I had been asleep for 2 hours when the knocking started. Not the doorbell, but knocking. The kind that meant someone was using their fist. I came downstairs in my robe with a flashlight, already composing the words I would say to whoever thought this was an appropriate hour to visit a piano shop. I opened the door and stopped composing anything. Sarah Calloway. My daughter-in-law. Marcus's wife. A woman I had met, perhaps a dozen times over the years at holidays, and the occasional awkward dinner. She was standing in the rain without an umbrella. She was holding a small rolling suitcase in one hand and the hand of a 9-year-old girl in the other. The girl was Elise. She was wearing a raincoat 2 sizes too large, and her pale eyes were wide open and very still, watching me the way children watch adults when they are trying to determine whether the adult can be trusted. Watching is not the right word. She was listening to me. Listening to my breathing, my posture, the sound my weight made on the floorboards. Deciding, with the instrument she had instead of sight, whether I was safe. Sarah looked like she had been driving for a long time. Her hair was soaked flat against her face, and there was a tightness around her mouth that I recognized as the expression of someone who had been holding herself together by force of will for longer than was sustainable. Please, she said. Just that word first. Then, I need you to take her. Please, keep her here. And do not tell Marcus where she is. I stepped back and let them both inside. I put Elise on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water and told her she was safe, which felt both true and insufficient. Then I walked Sarah into the kitchen and closed the door. What happened? I asked. She shook her head, not refusing to answer. More like she was deciding how much to say in the time she believed she had. She set her keys on the table. Her hands were not steady. I cannot explain everything tonight, she said. There is not enough time, and I need to get back before he realizes I am gone. She looked up at me. I just need to know she will be safe here with you. Of course she will. She is better with you than with either of us, Sarah said. She always has been. She is more like you than she is like Marcus. More like you than she is like me. She almost smiled when she said it. A tired, genuine smile that did not belong in that kitchen at that hour. You will see what I mean. I walked her back to the front door. She crouched down and held Elise for a long moment, whispering something into her hair that I could not hear. Then she stood, picked up her keys, and looked at me one last time. That was when I saw it. She shifted her coat to reach for the door handle, and the collar pulled back just enough. A bruise along the side of her neck faded to yellow-green at the edges, which meant it was several days old. She saw me see it. She did not explain. She pulled the collar back into place, opened the door, and walked out into the rain. 1 week later, the Vermont State Police called. Sarah had been found in her apartment in Burlington. Prescription medication. The officer on the phone used the words apparent suicide and history of depression in a flat, professional voice, and I listened and said thank you, and hung up and sat in the same kitchen chair I was sitting in now. I stared at the wall for a long time. I had told myself it was what it appeared to be. I had told myself this with consistency and discipline for 6 years. The bruise could have been from anything. Sarah's fear that night was the fear of a difficult marriage, not the fear of something worse. People take their own lives, and sometimes the people closest to them never see it coming. The absence of an explanation is not the same as the presence of something sinister. I had been very thorough about telling myself these things. Now, sitting in the same chair, with the trust documents on the table and Elise asleep in the next room, Elise, who had been quietly building legal defenses since she was 13, who moved through the world like someone who understood from a very early age that danger was real and preparation was the only answer. I found that I could no longer make myself believe the story I had been telling. Sarah had been afraid of Marcus specifically. She had said, "Do not tell Marcus. Do not tell anyone, Marcus." She had brought Elise to me because she believed I was the safest option available, and 1 week later she was dead in an apartment with a bottle of pills and a report that asked no further questions. I sat with that for a long time in the yellow lamplight while the lake pushed against the rocks outside and the kitchen clock marked seconds it had no opinion about. I had spent 6 years not hearing the note Sarah had played for me that night. Standing in my doorway, soaking wet, with a bruise she did not explain and a daughter she was trying to save. She had played one clear note, and I had refused to hear it. The note that said, "He is the danger." The note that said, "Please do not look away from this." I had looked away. That was the truth I owed myself at 71 years old. In a kitchen that smelled like cold tea and old wood. I picked up my cup. The tea was completely cold. I drank it anyway. The answer, if there was one, was not something I was going to find sitting still. I opened the shop an hour earlier than usual the next morning. There was no reason to. No appointments. No urgent repairs. I simply could not sit in the kitchen any longer. And the workbench was the one place where my hands had something useful to do even when my head did not. I had been resurfacing a set of worn hammer felts for about 40 minutes when I heard the familiar sound of the front step creaking under a particular weight. Some sounds you learn over decades without trying to. That creak belonged to one person. Frank Maddox pushed the door open with his shoulder the way he always did, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the diner 3 blocks east. He was 66, broad through the chest, in a way that had not softened much with age, with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried movements of a man who had spent 30 years as a criminal investigator for the Vermont State Police and had learned that rushing rarely improved anything. He had retired 4 years ago and now lived 6 blocks from my shop, which meant he stopped in roughly once a month to drink coffee and say very little in a companionable way. He set one of the cups on my workbench without asking if I wanted it. "You are here early," he said. "So are you." He pulled the stool out and sat down. He looked at the legal envelope still sitting at the end of the bench. He did not pretend to be surprised by it. "I heard Marcus was back in town," he said. "From who?" "A contact at the FBI field office in Burlington. Name came up about 8 months ago in connection with a financial matter. I've been paying attention since then." Frank wrapped both hands around his cup. He had a way of pausing before he said things that mattered, not for dramatic effect, but because he genuinely thought before he spoke. which I had come to understand was rarer than it should be. Your son is in serious financial trouble, Henry. The kind that does not resolve on its own. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a business card on the workbench beside my coffee. The name on it belonged to a deputy district attorney. You do not need to call today, but keep it. He told me what he had found through public records and quiet conversations with people who owed him professional favors. Marcus had borrowed $1.8 million from a private lending organization based in New Jersey. Not a bank, not a registered financial institution. An operation that existed in the space between legal lending and something considerably less legal, and charged interest accordingly. The repayment deadline was December 31st. 6 weeks away. If he does not pay by the end of the year, Frank said, the consequences will not be handled in a courtroom. There was more. The Securities and Exchange Commission had opened a preliminary investigation into investment accounts Marcus had managed for 42 private clients, most of them retirees who had trusted him with amounts between $20,000 and $50,000 each. The structure had the characteristics of what investigators call a Ponzi scheme, a fraudulent arrangement in which returns paid to earlier investors come not from actual profits, but from money taken from newer investors. The total amount involved was roughly $700,000. A formal referral to the Department of Justice was expected within 90 days. Frank stood and finished his coffee. The guardianship petition is not about Elise, he said. It is about reaching $6 million before December 31st. At the door, he paused. There is something else I have been looking at. I am not ready to talk about it yet, but I want you to know I am looking. He left, without explaining further. That was Frank. He told you exactly as much as he had confirmed, and not one word more. 2 days later, Diane Price came to the shop alone. There was no phone call, no appointment. She appeared at the door at 2 in the afternoon while Elise was at tutoring, and I was alone behind the counter. She sat in the customer chair, crossed her ankles, and placed a manila folder on the glass between us. I want to be direct with you, she said. Her voice carried the smooth reasonableness of someone accustomed to winning conversations without raising her voice. Marcus and I are both concerned about Elise, not about who she is or what she is capable of. She is clearly remarkable. But the practical reality is that a 15-year-old with a visual disability managing assets of this size, without professional oversight, that is a situation that could go wrong in ways that would be very difficult to correct. She opened the folder and turned it toward me. This is a medical and educational support application. It would allow Marcus to provide structured oversight of the trust, with full court supervision and transparency. I pulled the folder toward me and read through the first 2 pages slowly. My father had taught me to always read the part they do not summarize for you. By the 3rd page, I understood what I was actually looking at. In American law, a power of attorney is a legal document that grants one person the authority to act on behalf of another in financial or legal matters. What Diane had presented as a support application was, in its operative clauses, a broad financial power of attorney that would give Marcus effective control over Elise's trust. It was not a support document. It was a transfer of control dressed in the language of care. I will need time to read through this properly, I said. Diane smiled, the same practiced smile she had used at my counter 3 days ago. Of course. Take all the time you need. She left the folder when she stood to go. At the door, she paused. I do hope we can resolve this without it becoming adversarial, Mr. Calloway. That would not be good for anyone, especially not for Elise. I watched her walk to her car through the front window. Then I stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the folder she had left behind. The back door opened. Elise came in from tutoring, dropped her bag, and stopped when she heard my silence. She was here, Elise said. Not a question, just left. Elise walked to the counter and placed her hand flat on the folder. Then she said something that rearranged my understanding of the previous 30 minutes. I was here before she arrived. I came in through the side entrance during your lunch break and placed an acoustic signature tag in the spine of this folder while it was still in her briefcase in the front seat of her car. The car was unlocked. An acoustic signature tag, she explained, was a microtransmitter smaller than a postage stamp that emitted a unique audio frequency when activated by proximity to a paired receiver. If the physical folder was ever examined, the tag would confirm that this specific document was the original Diane had brought, not a substituted or altered copy. I also captured the metadata from her laptop, Elise continued. When she opened her briefcase at the counter, I pointed my phone at the lacquered surface of the Steinway. The reflection was narrow but sufficient. My screen conversion app read the image and described the file properties in audio. The document she presented to you was created 4 days after the date printed on its cover page. The modification log shows edits made after the document was printed. She paused. That is called backdating. When used in the context of a legal proceeding, it is document fraud. I looked at the folder on the counter, then at my granddaughter, who was standing with her hands at her sides and her pale eyes aimed at nothing, having just described a counterintelligence operation she had executed while I was eating a sandwich. How did you know she would come today? I asked. I did not, Elise said. I have had the tag ready for 2 weeks. I check her car every morning, on my way to tutoring. Today the folder was there, so I placed it. She picked up her bag and walked toward the kitchen. At the doorway, she stopped. One thing at a time, Grandpa, she said. We are still on the first one. The tablet arrived 3 days after Diane's visit, delivered to the tutoring center in a gift box with a handwritten note that read, "For Elise, so you can stay connected. Warmly, Diane." Elise brought it home in its unopened box and set it on the kitchen table without comment. She did not unwrap it. She did not turn it on. She connected a USB cable from her laptop to the device through a small opening in the packaging and sat in front of her screen with her headphones on, listening to something I could not hear. I put the kettle on and sat down across from her. Through the window above the sink, the evening had gone dark. Just the sound of water against rock, somewhere below the bluffs. Give me about 10 minutes, she said. I watched her work and tried to follow what she was doing, though most of it was happening in a language I did not speak. After she finished, she explained it to me in the patient precise way she always explained technical things, starting from what I already understood and building outward. When a tablet or phone is manufactured, she told me, it runs on software called firmware, which controls the basic operations of the device before any applications are installed. It is possible to embed a monitoring program inside that firmware layer, deeper than the visible software, in a place most users would never think to look, and most standard security scans would not detect. The application she had found was designed to periodically transmit the device's location and screen content to an external server. How did you find it? I asked. You have not even turned it on. I did not need to turn it on, she said. When I connected it to my laptop through the cable, the device received just enough power to activate the firmware. The monitoring application attempted to send a handshake signal to its external server. That signal was transmitted through the tablet's speaker as an ultrasonic pulse, a sound above the normal range of human hearing. She paused. I heard it. Elise's hearing extended well beyond the standard human frequency range. Her audiologist had documented it years ago. Sounds that registered as silence for most people were, for her, as clear and legible as a note struck on a well-tuned piano. The tablet had whispered its secret in a frequency it assumed no one could hear, and it had whispered it to the one person in the room for whom that frequency was perfectly audible. So she wanted to track you, I said. She wanted to know where I was, what I was reading, and what I was typing. That is useful information if you are building a legal case and want to know whether the other side is preparing a defense. Elise closed the laptop halfway. Then she looked at me, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one I had seen in weeks. I am going to use it, she said. Turned on, connected, behaving exactly like a normal tablet. I will send messages that I want her to see. I will let her believe she knows what I know. She picked up the box and set it aside. The most useful thing an opponent can give you is the belief that they are in control of the information. That evening, she powered on the tablet, opened the messaging application, and sent Diane the first text. I read it over her shoulder before she sent it. Hi, Diane. Thank you so much for the tablet. It is really nice. Can I ask you something? I saw the words fiduciary duty in the papers the lawyer sent Grandpa, and I looked it up, but I am still not sure I understand it. Could you explain what it means? She sent it and placed the tablet face up on the table between us. She will answer, Elise said. How do you know? Because she thinks I do not understand what I am asking. She thinks she is texting a blind girl who needs help with big words. She does not know my screen reader converts every message into audio in real time. She does not know I understand every term in that petition better than she does. Elise was right. Diane replied within 20 minutes. 4 days after the tablet arrived, Marcus called on video. I was in the back room when the phone rang, his name on the screen. I sat down at the small desk and answered. He looked better on camera than he had in the shop. He had shaved, and the lighting was forgiving. He smiled when my face appeared. Dad. Good. You picked up. I was not sure you would. I almost did not, I said honestly. He talked for a while. He asked about the shop, whether business was steady, whether I had any interesting repair jobs lately. He mentioned that he and Diane were staying in Burlington for a few weeks, that it was good to be near family. He said the word family 3 times in the first 4 minutes. I counted. Then gradually the conversation shifted. He asked whether Elise's trust had been properly registered with the Vermont court. He asked who the trustee of record was. He asked whether I had my own legal representation. He asked whether the patent proceeds had been fully transferred into the trust or whether any portion was still held in a personal account. I answered each question with as little information as possible. Not with lies, but with the careful use of the truth. Yes, I have an attorney. Yes, the paperwork is in order. I will need to check on that. I am not sure of the exact figures. 20 minutes into the call, I realized something that should not have surprised me but did. He had not asked a single question about Elise herself. Not about her health. Not about how she was managing her condition. Not about school or friends, or what she was interested in, or whether she was happy. Not one question that a father asks about a daughter he has not seen in 6 years. Every question had been about the money. I should let you get back to your evening, he said eventually, settling into the warm tone he had opened with. I just want you to know that Diane and I are coming from a place of genuine concern. Elise is family. We want what is best for her. I know you said that, I said. I ended the call. I sat in the dark back room for a while. The only light came from the small desk lamp and the faint glow of the electronic tuner on the shelf. I thought about the conversation and tried to find something in it I could hold on to. Some thread of the sun I had raised. Some genuine note beneath the performance. I was still looking when Elise appeared in the doorway. How did it go? She asked. He did not ask about you once, I said. Not once in 20 minutes. She leaned against the door frame. She did not look surprised. She had stopped being surprised by her father a long time ago. What did he ask about? The trust. The accounts. My attorney. The patent proceeds. She nodded slowly. Then she said, Frank called while you were on with him. He wants you to come by tomorrow morning. He said he found things about Dad's finances that you need to hear before the first court date. She paused. He sounded like he meant it. 4 days after Diane sent the tablet, Elise showed me the message thread. I had not seen it until then. She had been managing it deliberately, she explained. Composing each response with the care of someone adjusting a temperament 1 interval at a time, making sure every string she touched moved the whole instrument in the direction she intended. She turned the tablet so the screen reader could play the conversation aloud for both of us. We sat at the kitchen table and listened together. In the first exchange, Elise had asked what would happen if a guardian was appointed for her. Diane had replied. The court does not need to prove you are incapable of making decisions. They only need to establish that you are a minor with a documented medical condition managing a significant asset. At that point, appointing a financial guardian is almost routine. The guardian would then have legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf. In a follow-up, Elise had asked whether the guardian would control everything. Diane had written back, "Once a financial guardian is appointed, all assets under the minor's name, including trust assets, in many circumstances, fall under the guardian's management authority. It is really just a protective measure." I set the tablet down on the table. In Vermont, as in most American states, a person under 18 cannot enter into binding financial contracts without a guardian's consent. However, a properly structured irrevocable trust, one that has already been executed with a court-recognized guardian acting on the minor's behalf, sits in a different legal category. What Diane described was accurate for standard guardianship situations, but she had either overlooked or was unaware that Elise's trust had been specifically drafted to withstand exactly this scenario. She had revealed her entire legal strategy to the person she was trying to outmaneuver because she had not considered that the person listening to those messages through a screen reader might understand every word better than she did. "She told you everything," I said. "She told me what she thinks will happen," Elise said. "Which means we know exactly where her argument breaks and exactly what we need to counter." She took the tablet back. "I have already forwarded the full conversation to Frank with the metadata showing it originated from the device she sent me and the server logs showing her account on the other end." I looked at my granddaughter across the kitchen table. Outside, the lake was doing what it always did. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked the way it always ticked, and Elise sat with the tablet in her hands, entirely calm, the way she sat when a tuning was proceeding exactly as she had planned. The next morning I drove to Frank's office. It was a single room above a dry cleaning shop at the end of a quiet street that had been there longer than either of us had lived in the neighborhood. The stairs creaked in a different place every season depending on the weather. That morning they sounded heavier than usual. Though, that might have been me. Frank was at his desk with 3 folders open and a coffee going cold at his elbow. He looked up when I came in, gestured to the chair, and waited until I was settled before he began. "I am going to tell you some things," he said. "Some of it comes from my contact at the FBI field office. Some of it I found through public court filings. None of it is classified. But I want you to understand where it is coming from before you hear it." He opened the first folder and laid the documents flat so I could read them. The loan agreement, the repayment schedule, the name of the lending entity, which was not a name I recognized and was not meant to be recognized. The interest rate, which was nearly 4 times what any legitimate lender would charge. And the penalty clause, written in language that did not bother to disguise what it meant. $1.8 million, Frank said. Due in full by December 31st. 41 days from today. He looked at me steadily. "The people who hold this debt do not file lawsuits, Henry. They do not send letters. When this deadline passes, whatever happens next will not involve attorneys." He opened the second folder. The SEC preliminary findings. 42 investors. $700,000 moved through accounts that produced no actual returns. Frank walked me through the structure. How the early investors were paid with money from the later ones. How the statements Marcus sent to his clients showed growth that existed only on paper. A Ponzi scheme is not complicated in its mechanics. It is simply a lie told with numbers instead of words, sustained until the numbers run out. A federal referral to the Department of Justice is expected within 90 days, Frank said. Conviction on a single count carries up to 20 years. He closed the second folder. Then he placed both hands flat on the desk on either side of the third folder, which remained closed. "There is something else," he said. His voice shifted. Not louder. Slower. The way he spoke, when what he was about to say had weight, he did not want to drop carelessly. "I have been looking at the original case file from Sarah's death. the report filed by the Burlington Police Department 6 years ago. He looked at me the way he looked at things. He was not yet willing to say with certainty, but could no longer keep entirely to himself. There are inconsistencies in it. Small ones. The kind a person would miss unless they had spent 30 years reading case files and knew what a clean report is supposed to look like. He paused. I have flagged it to a contact at the FBI. I am waiting to hear back. I do not have anything confirmed. Tell me what you are looking at. I said. I am not going to do that yet, he said. Because if I am wrong, I do not want to have put something in your head that cannot be taken out. He stopped. And if I am right, I want to make sure we do it in the right order. Evidence first, then conclusions. I drove back to the shop along the coast road, with the radio off and both hands on the wheel. My hands trembled the way they always did. The lake was flat and gray on my left, stretching to a horizon I could not quite see. I thought about what Frank had not said, about the folder he had not opened, about a case file from 6 years ago that apparently did not look the way a clean case file was supposed to look. The story I had told myself about Sarah was breaking apart. Not all at once, but in the way a piano breaks when its soundboard develops a crack. You do not hear the crack itself. You hear every note after a change. Every frequency shifts. Every chord sounds wrong in a way you cannot fix by tuning individual strings. Because the problem is not in the strings. The problem is in the thing that holds them all together. Something in the structure of what I had believed for 6 years had cracked. And I could hear it now in everything. I could not sleep. It was not unusual. I had been sleeping in shorter intervals since Marcus arrived, waking at 2 or 3 in the morning with the particular alertness of a mind that had continued working while the body rested. Most nights I lay still and waited for it to pass. That night I got up, pulled on my work clothes, and went downstairs to the shop. The workroom at the back had always been the one place I could think clearly. Something about the smell of it, the specific quality of its silence, the way the work itself required a level of attention that left no room for anything else. I turned on the small lamp over the main bench and stood for a moment looking at the room. Then I looked at the Steinway. It sat in the center of the showroom the way it had for 20 years. A Model B semi-concert grand. 6 feet 11 inches of spruce and maple and cast iron. With a soundboard that projected tone the way a cathedral projects a whisper. It was the kind of instrument that drew every eye in the room, which meant it was the kind of instrument that anyone standing in the front of the shop would naturally face at some point during a conversation. From where it sat, it had a clear line to the counter, the sitting area, and both doors. I went to the supply cabinet and found what I was looking for in the third drawer from the bottom. The miniature microphone modules Elise used in her prototype testing for her acoustic navigation designs. They were roughly the size of a shirt button, capable of recording audio wirelessly to a paired tablet. Battery life of 72 hours. Frequency response flat, from 20 Hz to 22,000, which meant they captured everything the human voice could produce and a good deal of what it could not. I carried the Steinway's lid prop to its highest position and looked inside. What I did next was not complicated. After 50 years of working inside piano mechanisms, I knew the interior of a grand piano, the way most people know their own handwriting. The soundboard, the large curved sheet of spruce that amplifies and projects every note the instrument plays, is suspended under tension across the bottom of the case. Along its perimeter, where the board meets the inner rim, there are narrow gaps that exist purely for structural expansion and serve no acoustic function. The microphone module fit inside one of those gaps with room to spare. I secured it with a small amount of luthier's adhesive, ran the wireless antenna along the underside of the rim where it would be invisible from any angle, and paired the module to the tablet I kept locked in the workroom cabinet. The work took 35 minutes. My hands trembled the way they always did. But they did not miss. 50 years of setting pins and shaping hammers and threading damper wire had given these hands a vocabulary of their own. They knew what to do even when the rest of me was uncertain. I lowered the lid, set the prop back to its resting position, and stood back. The Steinway looked exactly as it had for 20 years. The strings gleamed under the showroom light. The fallboard was closed. The pedals caught a faint reflection from the lamp. Nothing about it suggested that anything had changed. Every instrument has a voice, I thought. You just have to give it a reason to speak. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of late November day that reminded you winter was not something approaching but something already underway. Marcus and Diane arrived at 10 minutes past 9 without calling ahead. I had the tablet recording in the workroom before they reached the front door. They came in together. Marcus in front with that practiced ease. Diane a half step behind and to his left, positioned to observe the room while he managed the conversation. They sat in the 2 chairs I kept for customers, and Marcus opened with the kind of small talk designed to establish comfort before arriving at whatever he had actually come to say. Elise appeared from the back hallway about 5 minutes after they arrived. She was carrying her notebook, which she set on the counter beside her without comment. I noticed she had already written the date and time at the top of the page in the raised letter shorthand she used for her own records. Marcus looked at her with an expression that took visible effort to arrange. Elise. You look well. Thank you, she said. We were hoping we would get a chance to talk with you, he said. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, adopting the posture of someone making a sincere effort. I know this whole situation has been stressful. Diane and I want you to know we are not here to make things harder. We are here because we care about what happens to you. Elise sat with her hands resting on her notebook. Her pencil moved slowly across the page. She was not drawing. She was writing. That is kind of you, she said. What are you working on? He asked, nodding at the notebook. Notes, she said. Diane placed a manila envelope on the counter. We have prepared a revised proposal, she said, her voice carrying the smooth reasonableness of someone who had negotiated many rooms into agreement. A shared management structure. Marcus would have a formal advisory role in the oversight of the trust. With full court supervision and complete transparency, we believe it addresses the concerns the court will want to see resolved and keeps everything within the family. I looked at the envelope but did not touch it. Marcus tried once more with Elise. He asked what she liked most about living on the coast. He asked whether she found the work in the shop interesting. He asked whether she had plans after school. The questions were the right questions. They were simply 6 years too late. And they landed with the hollow sound of things rehearsed rather than felt. Elise answered each one in a sentence or less, and wrote something after each answer. What do you like best? He asked finally. From when you were little, I mean. Is there anything you remember that you enjoyed? Elise stopped writing. She raised her head and turned it toward his voice. It was the first time she had held the direction of his presence for more than a moment. I liked it when adults told the truth, she said. The room was quiet for a beat. I am telling the truth, Marcus said. Okay, Elise said. She went back to her notes. Diane set a second document on top of the envelope. This is our final offer before the first hearing. We would prefer to resolve everything privately. Elise did not reach for either document. Could you leave those here? She said. Grandpa and I need to read through them carefully. After they left, I went directly to the workroom and opened the tablet. 48 minutes of recording. Audio clean throughout. The Steinway soundboard had done exactly what soundboards are designed to do. It had taken every vibration in that room and amplified it with faithful precision. I sent the file to Frank before I made coffee. Then I carried the envelope to the back room, where Elise was already waiting with her laptop open. Same as last time? I asked. Scan everything before we touch it, she said. Then we read. But the recording from Saturday's visit was not the one that would matter most, because the Steinway was still listening. And what it heard that night, long after the shop had closed and the lights had gone dark, would change everything. I checked the recording the next morning before Elise came downstairs. The tablet's file manager showed 2 entries from the Steinway's microphone. The first was the 48-minute session from Saturday's visit, which I had already sent to Frank. The second was time-stamped 11:47 in the evening, and it ran for 36 minutes. I put in my earbuds and pressed play. For the first few seconds, there was nothing. The ambient silence of a closed shop at night. The faint hum of the baseboard heater. The occasional creak of the building, settling against the cold. Then I heard a sound I recognized, but had not thought about in decades. The particular scrape of a brass key in the front door lock. It was the spare key. The one I had given Marcus when he was 17 and had a habit of coming home after I had already locked up for the night. I had not thought about that key since the day he left. I had not thought to change the locks. The door opened. 2 sets of footsteps entered the shop. One heavy on the left heel, one in hard-soled shoes. I had heard Elise describe those exact footsteps the morning Marcus first arrived. For 36 minutes, the Steinway's soundboard captured everything. Marcus went through the filing cabinet beside the counter. I could hear drawers sliding open and papers being handled. Diane moved to the workbench area. The distinct sound of a phone camera shutter repeated at irregular intervals as she photographed documents. At one point, she tried the small lockbox I kept on the top shelf. It rattled but did not open, because it was empty. I had moved its contents to the workroom safe 2 days earlier, on a feeling I had not been able to explain at the time. At the 29-minute mark, the footsteps converged near the center of the room, near the Steinway. And Diane spoke. Her voice came through the soundboard with a clarity that surprised me. A grand piano's soundboard is designed to project and amplify acoustic energy. It does not distinguish between a concert performance and a whispered conversation. It simply does what it was built to do. He has hidden things better than I expected, Diane said. Her tone was low but unhurried. The tone of someone who believed she was speaking in complete privacy. But it does not matter at the hearing. We do not need to find anything. We just need to argue that a 71-year-old man with trembling hands is not a competent financial guardian for a minor managing assets of this size. The judge will look at him and see exactly what we need her to see. Marcus said nothing. I heard him take a few steps, pause, and then the front door opened and closed. They were gone. I sat at the workbench with the earbuds still in, and the recording finished, and the shop perfectly quiet around me. Trembling hands. That was the phrase she had chosen. And she was right that my hands trembled. They had trembled for years. They trembled when I held a coffee cup, when I signed a check, when I reached for a doorknob. They trembled right now, holding the tablet in the half-light of the workroom at 6 in the morning. But they trembled because they had spent 50 years threading damper wire through felt bushings no wider than a grain of rice. They trembled because they had reset 10,000 tuning pins and shaped 10,000 hammerheads and brought 10,000 instruments back to life with nothing but touch and patience and time. My hands did not shake because they were failing. They shook because they had been working longer and harder and more precisely than most hands ever would. That was not weakness. That was the cost of a life spent doing something that mattered. In Vermont, entering a property without the current owner's authorization, even with a key obtained years earlier, constitutes criminal trespass. If the entry is made with the intent to commit a crime, such as photographing private documents or obtaining information to be used in a fraudulent legal proceeding, the charge escalates to burglary in the second degree. What the Steinway had recorded was not a visit. It was a crime. I sent the full recording to Frank at 7 in the morning with a message that said only, "Last night." All of it. Frank responded 40 minutes later. Received. Do not go inside the shop until I call you. Meet me at the coffee shop across the street. Elise came downstairs shortly after. I told her about the recording. She listened without interrupting, then asked to hear the last 3 minutes for herself. She put in her earbuds, sat very still, and listened to Diane's voice come through the soundboard of the instrument we both knew, as well as we knew each other. When it finished, she removed the earbuds and said, "She rehearsed that. The phrasing is too clean to be spontaneous. She has been practicing that argument for the hearing." Then she turned to the manila envelope Diane had left on the counter the day before. The final proposal. "I scanned this last night after you went to bed," she said. She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward me, though the information was already playing through her earbuds as audio. Same pattern as the first document. Created 3 days after the date printed on the cover page. Modification log shows 2 edits made after the document was printed. Both in the section defining the scope of Marcus's proposed advisory authority. She closed the laptop halfway. 2 separate documents. 2 separate occasions. The same method both times. She paused. I will give both analyses to Mr. Whitfield when we meet with him. He will have a forensic document examiner confirm everything independently. That is the standard process for submitting this kind of evidence in a fraud proceeding. I looked at the 2 folders side by side on the table. Diane Price had brought fraudulent documents into my shop twice, on 2 separate visits, apparently operating on the assumption that no one in a small piano tuner's house on the Vermont coast would know how to examine what she was handing them. Does she know you found this? I asked. No, Elise said. And I would like to keep it that way until the hearing. She stacked the folders neatly and placed them in the locked drawer of the workroom cabinet. Then she sat back down at the kitchen table and picked up her tea. I went to bed that night with the folders locked away and the tablet charged, and the Steinway still listening in the dark of the showroom. I lay awake for a while, thinking about the phrase trembling hands and the woman who had said it in a room she believed was empty, not knowing that the oldest instrument in the shop had heard every word and remembered all of it. Before I show you what Elise had been building in silence for 2 years, comment the word "listen" right now, so I know you are still here with me, because what comes next changes everything you thought you understood about this family. A note before we continue. The story ahead contains some fictional elements woven in for the purpose of storytelling and reflection. If that is not something you wish to hear, this is a comfortable place to stop. No hard feelings. The morning after I sent the break-in recording to Frank, I came downstairs to find Elise already at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside her. She had been up for a while. I could tell by the way she was sitting, the particular stillness of someone who has finished thinking and is now waiting for the right moment to speak. I poured coffee and sat down across from her without asking what she was working on. She would tell me when she was ready. That was how things moved in this house. Not on my schedule, on hers. She turned the laptop toward me after about a minute. On the screen was an account portal for a small law firm I did not recognize. Harwick and Pratt. Estate and Financial Law. Based in Portland, Maine. Established 2011. There was a transaction summary open on the page, dated 4 months earlier. I need to tell you something, Elise said. And I need you to hear all of it before you respond. All right, I said. 4 months ago, I asked you to sign a set of documents from this firm. I told you they were related to renewing the liability coverage on the shop's equipment inventory. She paused. They were not. I remembered the afternoon. A Tuesday, I thought, because she had come home from tutoring early and found me in the middle of regulating a grand piano action. She had placed 3 pages on the bench beside me with the relevant lines marked with small adhesive tabs, and I had signed where she indicated without reading past the summary she had prepared. I had been doing this with Elise's paperwork for years. It had never occurred to me to question it. What did I sign? I asked. A purchase agreement, she said. Through this firm, acting as your agent in your capacity as my legal guardian, you authorize the acquisition of a debt instrument from a private lending organization in New Jersey. She navigated to the next page of the portal. Marcus's $1.8 million loan. We bought it. I sat with that for a moment. In the United States, debt instruments, including loans made by private lenders, can be bought and sold between parties in what is known as the secondary debt market. When a lender believes a borrower is unlikely to repay, they will often sell the debt to a third party at a discount rather than pursue costly collection. The purchasing party then becomes the new creditor, the entity to whom the debt is legally owed. The funds had come from the patent proceeds. The same $6 million Marcus was trying to reach. Elise had directed a portion of it, at the time the trust was established, into a separate account, specifically designated for this purpose. She had planned the acquisition before the ink on the licensing agreement was dry. Marcus was coming to court to claim authority over his daughter's finances. His daughter was already his creditor. "He owes you $1.8 million, I said. "Legally, yes." Elise wrapped her hands around her teacup. If he had succeeded in being appointed my financial guardian, he would have gained access to the trust. But the debt he owes would have remained. And as his creditor, the trust would have held a senior claim against any assets he controlled, including any distributions he tried to take from it. She looked in my direction with her pale, still eyes. It was a fail-safe. If everything else did not work, this would have made it functionally impossible for him to extract money without triggering his own debt obligation. I looked at the transaction summary on the screen. $1,080,000. Authorized under my signature 4 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon while I was adjusting a grand piano action and not reading what I was signing. "Elise," I said. "I know," she said quietly. "I should have told you. I did not. Because I knew you would worry from the moment you found out. And I needed you to behave normally around Marcus and Diane. If you had known, it would have shown." She paused. "I am sorry, Grandpa. I handled it the way I thought was safest for you." I looked at her for a long time. Then I laughed. A short, genuine sound that surprised me when it came out. Not because anything was funny, but because there was something so precisely and unmistakably like Elise in the architecture of what she had done that I did not know what other sound to make. "Where did you learn to think like that?" I asked. She considered the question the way she considered most questions. "Seriously. And from more than one angle. From listening to you work," she said. "You always told me that the most important part of tuning a piano is not fixing the note that sounds wrong. It is understanding why it drifted in the first place and what the instrument was trying to do when it failed." That sent me somewhere I had not visited in a while. Back 3 years. To a night when Elise was 12. I had come to lock up the shop and found her still at the small desk in the corner with her headphones on and her screen reader running. She was listening to something, her fingers following lines of raised text on a sheet she had printed from a Braille embosser. I came closer and asked what she was reading. "Court filings," she said. "Dad's. He filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, twice in 3 years. The second one was dismissed because the trustee found evidence of concealed assets." She had been 12 years old, sitting alone in a piano shop after hours, listening to federal court records through a screen reader, teaching herself the language of financial collapse because she understood, even then, that knowing was the only form of protection available to her. That was the night it started. Not with anger. Not with fear. With a 12-year-old girl in a public database and the patient, methodical grief of someone who had already lost her mother and was determined not to lose anything else. That evening, after Elise had gone to her room, I checked the recording tablet before bed. The Steinway's microphone had captured nothing unusual from inside the shop, but something Frank had mentioned during our meeting came back to me. He had said Marcus had been planning this since before the patent sale was publicly recorded. That someone had been watching. I went to the front window and looked out at the street. It was dark. The shop across the way was closed. A single street lamp threw a circle of yellow light onto the wet pavement, and at the far edge of that circle, parked facing the shop, was a silver sedan I had not noticed before. A man sat in the driver's seat, looking at his phone. He had been there, I would later learn, on 11 separate occasions over the past 6 months. The first date on the log was 4 days after Marcus had filed the initial guardianship petition. This was never an impulse. This was never a desperate man making a reckless decision. This was a campaign. It had been planned, staffed, and funded, and it had started long before any of us were supposed to know it was happening. The days between the break-in recording and the first scheduled court hearing passed in what I can only describe as industrious silence. The shop opened each morning at the usual hour. Repairs came in and went out. I ate dinner with Elise every evening, and we talked about ordinary things. A Yamaha upright that needed new hammer shanks. A book she was reading about acoustic wave propagation. whether the weather would clear before Thanksgiving. We did not talk about Marcus or Diane or the hearing. There was nothing useful left to say about any of it. The preparation was done, or it was not. A new letter arrived from Diane's attorneys, 8 days after the Saturday visit. They had expanded the petition. In addition to the original guardianship application, they were now filing a separate action contesting my ownership of the shop building itself, arguing that the property had been partially funded through family assets during the period of Marcus's childhood and therefore represented an inheritance interest he was entitled to claim. They were also formally requesting that the court appoint an independent psychologist to evaluate my cognitive fitness as Elise's guardian, citing what the filing described as concerns about the judgment and decision-making capacity of an elderly individual managing significant financial assets on behalf of a disabled minor. I read the letter twice at the kitchen table while Elise was in the other room. Then I folded it and added it to the folder with everything else. The property claim had no legal foundation. In Vermont, property owned solely in one person's name, purchased with that person's documented funds, belongs to that person regardless of family relationships. Marcus had contributed nothing to this building in any form at any time. A competent judge would recognize the claim immediately for what it was: a pressure tactic designed to multiply the cost and complexity of defending against the primary petition. The psychological evaluation request was more deliberately unpleasant. Its purpose was not to win a legal argument, but to suggest one. To plant in the court's mind the image of a frail old man with shaking hands who perhaps could not be trusted with a 15-year-old girl and $6 million. It was the most efficient thing Diane had done. It cost nothing to file, and forced me to spend time and money responding to a premise I found deeply offensive. I called Thomas Whitfield that afternoon. I had reached Whitfield the week before through the contact chain that started with the deputy district attorney card Frank had given me. He was a family law and civil litigation attorney based in Burlington, mid-50s, with the kind of unhurried telephone manner that suggested he had heard most things at least once before and was not easily rattled by any of them. We met at his office 10 days before the first hearing. The office was clean and orderly, in the way that working offices rarely manage to be. Every folder had a place. Every surface was clear except for what was actively being used. He shook our hands when we arrived, gestured us to the chairs across from his desk, and then spent the next 20 minutes reading through everything Elise had prepared without speaking a single word. When he finished, he set the last folder down and was quiet for a moment. "How long did it take you to put this together?" he asked Elise. "The documentation itself, about 3 weeks," she said. "The preparation behind it, about 2 years. Whitfield looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an assumption. Then he looked at me, and I could see him doing the same thing. "The metadata analysis," he said. "I will need to have this confirmed by a forensic document examiner before we can submit it as evidence. That is standard procedure. A court will not accept self-generated analysis from an interested party, but if an independent examiner reaches the same conclusions, it becomes admissible and it carries significant weight." He tapped the folder. "I have someone I use regularly. I will send this to her today." "How long?" I asked. 4 to 5 days. "We have time before the hearing." He made a note on his legal pad. "The acoustic signature tag in the document cover. I want that verified as well. It does not prove the backdating on its own, but it closes a potential argument about chain of custody. Opposing counsel could argue the documents were substituted or tampered with after Diane left them. The tag eliminates that argument." He moved to the expanded petition. The property claim would be disposed of in a preliminary motion. The psychological evaluation request, he explained, was actually more useful to us than it appeared, because it gave us grounds to request our own independent evaluation by a physician of our choosing. That evaluation would produce a documented professional assessment of my fitness as guardian, an assessment that would directly contradict the insinuation Diane's filing was designed to create. "I would like to schedule that evaluation this week," he said, before the hearing. "Fine," I said. He looked at Elise again. "Is there anything else I should know? Anything in the preparation you have not walked me through yet?" Elise turned her head toward me. It was a brief movement, a question, not a hesitation. I gave her the small nod she was waiting for, though she could not see it. She heard it, the faint shift of fabric against the chair back, the slight change in the rhythm of my breathing that meant yes. She turned back to Whitfield. Yes, she said. But that part Grandpa will present. Not me. Whitfield looked at me with the expression of a man who had just been told that the case he thought he understood had at least one more layer beneath it. All right, he said. With me. With me. He wrote something on his legal pad and underlined it. I will look forward to hearing it. On the drive home, Elise sat in the passenger seat with her window cracked open and the cold Vermont air moving through the car. The lake was visible between the trees, flat and gray and very wide. Are you ready? She asked. I have been ready for a while, I said. I just did not know it yet. She turned back toward the window. I kept driving. In my jacket pocket, the old silver tuning fork rested against my chest the way it had for 30 years. Steady, unhurried, holding its single true note the way it always had. Waiting for the moment someone needed to hear it. The courthouse smelled the way I imagined it would. Antiseptic floors, old wood, and the particular stillness of a building where people come to prove things they wish they did not have to. I had been in this building once before, 23 years ago, to finalize the guardianship paperwork for Elise after Sarah's death. That morning I had felt nothing but grief and obligation. Standing in the corridor now, I understood how thoroughly a place could hold two entirely opposite memories at once. Elise walked beside me in a dark navy dress she had pressed herself the night before. She carried her leather folder, the same one she used in the shop to sketch acoustic diagrams, and I noticed she had not eaten breakfast. When I mentioned it, she said she was not hungry. Then, she reached over and straightened my tie without being asked. She could not see it. She had felt it. Her fingers had brushed my collar when we left the car and registered that the knot was sitting a quarter inch to the left. She corrected it the way she corrected a tuning pin. One precise adjustment. No second attempt needed. That was how Elise managed things she could not say out loud. Thomas Whitfield met us at the entrance to courtroom 4. He was carrying a stack of folders under one arm, and his reading glasses were pushed up onto his forehead the way they always were. They have not seen all of it, he said quietly. Their attorney requested discovery 2 days ago. I submitted the minimum required by statute. The rest goes in this morning as supplemental evidence. Elise tilted her head. Is that permitted? Supplemental evidence is allowed when it becomes available within 48 hours of the hearing. The forensic analysis of the acoustic tag was only certified yesterday afternoon. He paused. So, yes, it is permitted. Marcus and Diane arrived 11 minutes before the session opened. I watched them from across the corridor. Diane wore a charcoal suit I had not seen before. Her briefcase was new. Marcus wore a tie that was slightly too tight, and he kept touching the knot. He did not look in our direction. Diane did, once, briefly, and then said something to Marcus that made him straighten his shoulders. I had spent 40 years reading the small adjustments people make when they are trying to appear more certain than they feel. I recognized the posture. The hearing opened with Judge Eleanor Marsh presiding. She was methodical and unhurried, the kind of judge who read every document before anyone in the room was allowed to speak. Craig Elliott, Marcus's attorney, presented the guardianship petition first. He framed it around Elise's visual disability and what he described as the financial complexity of managing a trust instrument on behalf of a minor with documented medical needs. He used the phrase "in the child's best interest" 7 times. I counted. Thomas waited. When Judge Marsh asked for the respondent's position, he stood and submitted the supplemental evidence packet without preamble. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply presented. First, the metadata analysis. He walked the judge through the creation dates and the modification timestamps, explaining how the forensic document examiner had confirmed that both documents Diane had presented at the shop had been created days after the dates printed on their cover pages, and that text had been altered after printing in both cases. He used the word backdating once, and the phrase document fraud once, and let the evidence carry the rest. Second, he played 40 seconds of the audio recording. Diane's voice came through the courtroom speakers with the same clarity the Steinway soundboard had given it on the night it was captured. "We do not need to find anything. We just need to argue that a 71-year-old man with trembling hands is not a competent financial guardian." The courtroom was very quiet while it played. Marcus did not move. Diane's face did not change, but her hands, folded on the table in front of her, pressed together until the knuckles whitened. Third, Thomas submitted the certified forensic report on the acoustic signature tag, which confirmed that the folder examined by the independent analyst was the same physical folder Diane had brought to the shop on the date in question. Chain of custody verified. No substitution. No tampering. The courtroom held a silence that felt deliberate, the way a concert hall holds silence between movements. Craig Elliott stood and requested a recess. Judge Marsh denied it. What happened next took fewer than 4 minutes. Diane leaned across and spoke into Marcus's ear. Marcus stared at the table. Craig Elliott requested permission to confer with his client. Judge Marsh granted 2 minutes. At the end of those 2 minutes, Craig Elliott stood and said that his client wished to withdraw the guardianship petition without prejudice, meaning Marcus reserved the right to refile at a later date under different circumstances. Thomas was already on his feet. "Your Honor, the respondent requests that the withdrawal be entered with prejudice, given the evidence of document fraud now in the court record." Judge Marsh looked at the evidence packet in front of her for a long moment. She turned one page, then another. Then she removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. "I am going to take that request under advisement and issue a written ruling by the end of the week," she said. "In the meantime, I am referring the forensic materials to the district attorney's office for review under Vermont's forgery statute." She looked at Craig Elliott. "Counsel, I would advise your client to remain available." The gavel came down once. The session was closed. Outside, in the corridor, Elise stood very still with her leather folder held against her chest. Her face showed nothing, but her hands, wrapped around the folder, held it the way she held an instrument she had just finished tuning, with the quiet certainty of someone who knows it is right, even if the instrument itself will never know. Frank was waiting by the exit doors. He had not been permitted inside as a witness, but he had come anyway, because that was the kind of man he was. I watched him read the situation from our faces and nod slowly. The way one person confirms to another that something important has just happened. I did not feel relief. Relief was for situations that were over. What I felt was the specific alertness of someone who had just seen the first card turned in a game where most of the deck was still face down. On the drive home, Elise opened her folder on her lap and made a small notation I could not read. When I asked what she was writing, she closed the folder and was quiet for a moment. "There is something Frank did not tell you this morning," she said. "About what?" "About the man in the silver sedan." She waited until I had parked the car in the driveway before she continued. Not because she was afraid of the words, because she wanted me to be still when she said them. We sat in the driveway for a moment. The afternoon light came through the windshield at a low angle and turned everything the color of old brass. I turned off the engine and did not move. "His name is Dale Pruitt," Elise said. "He is 49 years old. He used to work as a risk analyst for the same private lending firm in New Jersey that gave Marcus the $1.8 million loan." She spoke the way she always spoke when delivering information she had already organized inside her head, steadily, without decoration, each sentence placed after the last like keys on a scale, ascending towards something I was not yet able to see. "Frank identified him through the license plate 3 weeks ago. He ran it through the DMV and cross-referenced the name with his FBI contact in Burlington. Dale Pruitt left the lending firm 14 months ago." She paused. 2 months after Mom died, I did not say anything immediately. There are moments when the mind receives a piece of information, and needs a few seconds to find somewhere to put it. I had repaired enough pianos to know that when a string slips off its hitch pin, you do not force it back. You release the tension first. Then you find the anchor point. Frank believes he was not just watching the shop. Elise continued. He believes Dale Pruitt was here to make sure you did not talk to anyone, or that I did not. She paused again. Frank flagged it to the FBI 3 weeks ago. They have been running their own surveillance on Pruitt since then. I asked her why Frank had told her and not me. She was quiet for a moment. Because he was not sure how you would react, she said. And because I asked him to tell me first. We went inside. I made coffee I did not drink. Elise sat at the kitchen table with her folder open, writing in the small raised letter shorthand she used for things she needed to remember precisely. I watched her the way I had watched her since she was 9 years old. Not hovering. Just present. The way you stay near a mechanism that is running under unusual load and might need you at any moment. Frank arrived at 6:15. He had the specific tiredness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for longer than he wanted to admit. He sat down at the kitchen table without removing his coat, which told me the visit was not going to be brief. He laid a folder on the table. Inside was a printed DMV record. A photograph taken from across the street showing a silver sedan with a partial license plate visible. A man in his late 40s sitting behind the wheel, and a one-page summary Frank described as a preliminary FBI profile. Dale Pruitt, former risk analyst. Departed the lending firm under circumstances that the employment record did not classify as voluntary resignation. Seen near the shop on 11 separate occasions over 6 months. The first sighting was 4 days after Marcus had filed the initial guardianship petition. He was not improvising, Frank said. Someone told him when to start and what to watch for. I looked at the photograph for a long time. The man in the car had the particular blankness of someone trained to wait without expression. I had seen that look before, on a different face, in a different context. Then I placed it. The morning Marcus first visited the shop. A car had been parked across the street the entire time. Silver. Newer model. I had assumed it belonged to a neighbor. He was here the first day, I said. When Marcus and Diane came inside, Frank made a note. Then he said what he had clearly come to say. Henry. His voice changed. Not louder. Heavier. The voice he used when he had crossed the line between what he suspected and what he could demonstrate. The FBI toxicology report on Sarah. The preliminary one I mentioned has been upgraded. The certified analysis came back 48 hours ago. He opened a second folder and placed it flat on the table between us. The original case file recorded Sarah's cause of death as self-administered prescription medication overdose. The secondary blood work, obtained under a federal warrant, tells a different story. The sample contained concentrations of synthetic histamine at levels that are not consistent with any allergic reaction, any prescription interaction, or any form of accidental ingestion. He looked at me carefully. The way he looked at things he had confirmed and could no longer keep to himself. The FBI toxicologist's assessment is that the compound was administered externally within 36 to 48 hours prior to death. At that concentration, it would have caused a systemic reaction severe enough to mimic anaphylactic shock. In a person found alone in an apartment with a history of depression and a medicine cabinet full of prescriptions, the original investigators had no reason to look further. He paused. They are looking further now. They are treating it as a potential homicide investigation. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the wall above the stove, a simple quartz movement I had installed myself 3 years ago, ticked with the indifference of something that measures time without caring what it contains. Elise did not look up from her folder. She said, without inflection, "I know." I turned to her. She met the direction of my voice, and I understood in the way you sometimes understand things before they are fully explained that she had known for longer than I had. Not everything, but enough. Enough to have started preparing 2 years ago, at age 13, when she first opened Pacer on her school laptop and typed her father's name into the search field. "How long?" I asked. "Since the week after the funeral," she said. "Mom called me the morning of the accident." She paused. The word she had used, accident, hung in the air between us like a note that no longer belonged in the chord. She said she had found something in Marcus's files. She said she was going to take it to a lawyer that afternoon. Elise closed her folder. She never made it to the lawyer. Frank sat very still. I sat very still. Outside, the Vermont evening came in quietly off the lake. And somewhere down the street, a neighbor's porch light flickered on, and the world continued to operate, as though nothing fundamental had just shifted inside this kitchen. "We need to talk about what happens next," Frank said finally. Elise raised her head. She turned toward his voice with the calm, measured focus she used when she was reassembling a mechanism she had taken apart the night before. Every piece accounted for. Every action deliberate. "I know what happens next," she said. "I have known since November. Before I tell you what this 15-year-old blind girl had planned from the very beginning, leave a piano emoji, or just the word ready in the comments. Because I promise you, nothing in this story is what it first appeared to be. A gentle reminder. The chapters ahead carry some fictional elements crafted carefully for the lesson they hold. You are always welcome to stop here. But something tells me you have been waiting for exactly this moment." I woke at 5 in the morning and lay still for a while, listening to the house. There was no sound from Elise's room, which meant she was either asleep or had been awake long enough to stop moving. With Elise, the two were sometimes difficult to distinguish. I had spent 50 years tuning pianos. I understood, in a way that was almost physical, the difference between an instrument sitting in natural silence and one that had been deliberately muted. Lying there in the dark, I began to understand that everything that had happened over the past 6 weeks, the envelope from Boston, the tablet Diane sent, the document on the counter, the microphone in the Steinway, the recording, the debt purchase, all of it had not simply unfolded. It had been arranged, and the hand that arranged it had been smaller than mine and steadier. Elise was already at the kitchen table when I came downstairs. She had made coffee and set out 2 cups, which meant she had heard me moving upstairs and timed it. In front of her were 3 folders, a yellow legal pad covered in her raised letter shorthand, and the leather notebook she carried everywhere. She looked up when I sat down and said, without preamble, "I need to show you something." She opened the first folder. Inside was a timeline she had drawn by hand on heavy paper, using a raised line drawing kit that allowed her to feel the positions of each entry as she placed them. It began 2.5 years earlier, in December of 2022, when she was 12 years old. It showed, in sequence, every action she had taken and the reason behind each one. The Pacer search that found Marcus's first bankruptcy filing. The email she had sent to a trust attorney in Burlington, introducing herself as someone inquiring on behalf of a family member. The draft trust document she had prepared and brought to me 9 months ago, which I had signed without fully understanding what I was authorizing. The patent proceeds directed into the trust the same day the licensing agreement was finalized. The secondary debt market research she had begun 4 months ago, after she confirmed the loan's maturity date through public filings, and the purchase of Marcus's debt through Harwick and Pratt, completed 6 weeks before Marcus walked through the front door of the shop. Every action laid out in sequence. Every decision connected to the one before it by a line she had drawn with a straight edge. Precise and deliberate. "You were 13 when you started," I said. 12, she said. "The week after Mom's funeral. I did not know everything then. I only knew that Marcus had filed for bankruptcy twice, and that Mom had been afraid of him for the last year of her life." She turned the page on her legal pad. "The rest I figured out as I went." She opened the second folder. Inside was the debt instrument itself, a formal assignment agreement, transferring Marcus's $1.8 million loan obligation from the original private lender to a holding entity registered in Delaware. The holding entity's beneficial owner, as listed in the trust documentation, was Elise Calloway. Thomas Whitfield had reviewed every page. The transaction had been executed legally, with full documentation, at 60 cents on the dollar. When the loan matures on December 31st, Elise said, Marcus will owe the full balance to the holding entity, which means he will owe it to me. She said this without triumph. In the same tone, she used to describe the resonance frequency of a soundboard she was studying. If he cannot pay, Thomas can file for a civil judgment and request asset freezing. That includes any legal fees he might try to use to refile the guardianship petition. She opened the third folder. Inside were printed copies of the text exchanges between Elise and Diane, annotated in raised markings with legal citations Thomas had added. Beside them were 2 printed transcripts of the Steinway recordings, one from the Saturday negotiation meeting and one from the break-in, each with specific passages bracketed and time-stamped. Attached to the back was a 1-page memo from Thomas, listing the charges the district attorney's office could pursue based on the available evidence. First-degree forgery, second-degree burglary, civil fraud in connection with the guardianship petition's false representations. Thomas submitted the annotated transcripts to the district attorney's office yesterday morning, Elise said. Before the hearing. I set down my coffee cup. Before the hearing. I repeated. I wanted the DA to have everything before Marcus had a chance to withdraw the petition and walk away clean. She turned toward me. Withdrawing the petition does not erase the forgery. It does not erase the break-in. Those are separate matters. They exist independently of the guardianship case. I looked at my granddaughter across the kitchen table. I had known this child since the afternoon she was born. I had held her when she was small enough to fit in the crook of one arm. I had taught her the names of every component inside a piano, from the tuning pin to the back post. I had thought, in my better moments, that I understood her. I understood now. That I had understood perhaps half. Frank arrived at 7:30. He came in without knocking, which he had started doing sometime in the past 2 weeks, poured himself coffee, and sat down. He looked at the folders on the table, then at Elise and said, You told him. I told him, she said. Frank set his cup down and looked at me with an expression I recognized. The specific look of a man who had been carrying a secret on someone else's behalf and was relieved to set it down. She came to me 6 weeks ago, he said. The day before Marcus first showed up at the shop, she laid out the full picture and asked me to verify the financial records independently. I did. Everything she told me checked out. He paused. I have been in law enforcement for 38 years, Henry. I have never in my life been briefed more thoroughly by anyone, let alone a 15-year-old. Outside, the December morning was gray and still. The shop would open in 2 hours. In 11 days, Marcus's loan would mature and the balance would come due. Somewhere in Burlington, a district attorney's office was reviewing a packet of evidence that had been assembled piece by piece by a girl who had started the work at age 12 with nothing but a school laptop, a screen reader, a public database, and the specific patient grief of someone who had decided that understanding was the only form of safety available to her. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. She did not pull away. She turned her hand over and held mine the way she had when she was small, and the shop was dark, and she was not yet afraid of anything. What do we do now? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Now we wait. And we let it finish. The week before Christmas passed, the way the final measures of a long piece pass. Slowly. With the particular tension of someone who has played everything correctly and is now waiting for the last chord to resolve. The shop opened each morning at 8. I serviced 2 upright pianos, replaced a cracked hammer shank on a baby grand, and restrung the bass section of a concert instrument that a retired music teacher had brought in from the coast. I did the work carefully and charged fair prices and spoke to my customers about the weather and the holidays. And none of them knew that in the workroom behind the counter, a tablet was connected to a microphone inside a Steinway, and that on my phone there was a folder of evidence that had already been submitted to a district attorney and an FBI field office and a circuit court judge who was expected to issue a written ruling before the end of the year. Elise spent the week in a rhythm that looked, from the outside, like the ordinary routine of a 15-year-old on winter break. She read. She worked on a small spinet piano she had been restoring since October, replacing the worn key bushings one at a time with a patience that made me tired just watching. She cooked dinner twice, both times producing something better than I would have managed. She checked her tablet with the measured-in frequency of someone expecting a specific message and who had decided that checking more often would not make it arrive sooner. What I did not tell Elise during that week was what Frank had shared with me about Sarah's medical records. I had thought carefully about the timing. She was 15 years old, and she had been carrying the weight of this situation for nearly 3 years without telling me. The planning, the preparation, the quiet management of things I had not known needed managing. I did not want to place the full weight of what Frank had found on her shoulders before the civil matter was resolved. There would be time for that afterward. There had to be. On Christmas Eve, we did what we had done every year since Sarah brought her to live with me. We sat at the Steinway together, and I showed her something new. It had started when she was 9, the first December after she arrived. I had taught her how equal temperament works, the mathematical compromise that allows a piano to play in all 12 keys by distributing the natural impurity of tuned intervals evenly across the scale. She had listened with her hands on the strings and asked me to play the same chord in 3 different temperaments so she could hear the difference. She was 9 years old, and she heard it on the first pass. Over the years, we had worked through stretch tuning, voicing techniques, regulation adjustments, and last year, the oral method for setting a temperament octave using only beats and intervals, no electronic tuner. Each lesson built on the one before, the way floors are laid in a building, one level supporting the next. This year, I had chosen something I had been saving. Concert pitch tuning. The art of bringing a full-size grand piano to standard pitch, a 440, using nothing but the ear. No reference tone. No tuning device. No external assistance of any kind. Just the tuner, the instrument, and the accumulated knowledge of what a correct interval sounds like when it rings true. It is the hardest thing a piano tuner can learn. Most never attempt it. The ones who master it spend decades arriving there. I had reached it in my late 40s, after 30 years at the bench. I wanted Elise to have it now, because I was 71 and my hands trembled, and I did not know how many more Christmas Eves I would have to give her things that mattered. We worked for 2 hours. I explained the starting point, how you choose a single string in the middle octave, and tune it to the pitch you carry inside your memory, the pitch you have heard so many times over so many years that it lives in you the way your own heartbeat does. Then you build outward from there, interval by interval, octave by octave, until the entire instrument is aligned to the truth of that one note. Elise listened and asked precise questions. She placed her hands on the plate and the bridges, feeling the vibrations change as I moved each tuning pin. At some point, she stopped asking questions entirely. She simply listened to my hands work, the way she had when she was small, with the concentrated stillness of someone absorbing something she intended to carry for a very long time. When I finished the last octave, she placed both hands flat on the soundboard and held them there. "I can feel it," she said quietly. "When it is in tune, the wood hums. There is a warmth in it, almost like breathing. When it is not, the wood resists. It tightens, like it is holding something it does not want to hold." I looked at her hands on the spruce and thought about Sarah. I thought about a winter evening 20 years ago, when Sarah was a girl of 11 or 12, sitting at this same Steinway while I tuned it for a customer. She had watched me work for nearly an hour without speaking, which was unusual for Sarah, who generally had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. When I finished, she had asked, "Does the piano know when it is in tune?" I had told her no. The piano does not know anything. It simply responds to what is done to it. She had thought about this for a moment, her chin resting on her hands on the fallboard. Then she said, "Well, then I will know for it." I had not thought about that conversation in years. Sitting beside Elise now, watching her hands rest on the soundboard of the same instrument, feeling for the hum that meant everything was aligned, I understood that Sarah had kept her word. She had known. She had known when things were out of tune in her own life, and she had tried to do something about it. She had tried to bring Elise to safety. She had tried to reach a lawyer. She had simply run out of time. I did not say any of this to Elise. Some things are better kept as the feeling behind the words, held the way a soundboard holds a note after the key has been released. Present but not struck, resonating in the wood, where only the instrument knows it is there. We sat together at the Steinway for a while longer after the lesson was done. Neither of us played. We just sat with the piano open between us, the strings gleaming in the lamplight, the soundboard humming with the faint residual energy of 2 hours of work, and the Vermont night pressing cold and quiet against the windows. At 11:40, on the night of December 30th, my phone rang. It was Thomas Whitfield. "Marcus's loan matures at midnight tonight," he said. "Oregon time. The full balance of $1.8 million is now due, and payable to the holding entity." I stood in the hallway in my robe. The house was dark except for the thin line of light beneath Elise's door upstairs. Through the wall I could hear the faint tick of the kitchen clock, steady and disinterested, counting toward a deadline it had no opinion about. "He has requested an extension," Thomas continued, through his attorney. "What did you say?" I said no. Thomas said it the way he said most things. Without inflection. Without satisfaction. A statement of position, not a performance. "I will file the emergency asset freeze petition first thing tomorrow morning under Vermont Rule of Civil Procedure 83. Once that is granted, Marcus will not be able to move, transfer, or encumber any assets pending resolution of the debt claim." He paused. A shorter pause than usual, which told me there was more. "I also received a call this evening from the FBI. They have asked that we not discuss the details of the civil filing publicly until after they have completed a related action they have scheduled for the morning of December 31st. I stood in the hallway for a moment after he hung up. The word action sat in the silence, the way a struck note sits in a room after the damper has lifted. Present. Resonant. Waiting to be understood. At the top of the stairs, Elise's door opened. She stood in the dark, and I could not see her face. Only the outline of her, against the faint glow from her desk lamp. "Thomas?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said. A pause. "Tomorrow morning," she said. It was not a question. "Tomorrow morning," I said. She went back into her room and closed the door softly, the way she closed the lid of a piano after the last tuning of the day. With care, and with the specific gentleness of someone who understands that what is inside will need to be opened again. I stood in the hallway a little longer. I thought about the Steinway downstairs in the dark showroom, its soundboard still paired to the tablet in the workroom, its microphone still listening to the silence of an empty shop. I thought about how a complicated instrument can sit for years in a room without making a sound, holding its pitch, maintaining its tuning, waiting with mechanical patience for the moment someone finally lifts the fallboard and asks it to play. I did not sleep. I went downstairs and sat in the shop before 6. Not because there was work to do. The shop was closed for the holiday, but it was the only place I knew how to be still, and this was not a morning for restlessness. I did not turn on the overhead lights. Just the small lamp above the workbench, which threw its usual circle of warm light across the bench top and no further. The Steinway was a dark shape in the center of the showroom, its curves catching the faintest edge of the lamp's glow. I sat on the bench stool and looked at it, and did not play it. Frank arrived at 6:15. He knocked. That was the detail that told me. In the past 3 weeks, Frank had stopped knocking. He had started letting himself in, the way people do when a house has become familiar enough that formality feels like an obstacle. The fact that he knocked this morning meant that what he was bringing through the door required the dignity of being announced. He came in and stood on the customer side of the display cases. He had never stood there before. He had always come around to my side, pulled up the stool, and sat down. This morning he stood, and the distance he kept between us was not coldness. It was respect for the weight of what he was about to say. The arrest warrant for Marcus Calloway was executed at 5:52 this morning, he said. He was taken into federal custody at the Burlington address he and Diane were renting. There was no incident. He paused. The charges on the warrant include wire fraud under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343, conspiracy to commit fraud, and one count of homicide by abuse under Vermont law, pending the formal grand jury indictment that the United States Attorney's Office expects to return within the week. I set my hands on the workbench. They trembled. They always trembled. But this morning I let them, without apology, without the reflex of tucking them into my pockets or pressing them flat against the wood to hide the shaking. They had earned the right to tremble. Diane? I asked. Interviewed and released pending further investigation, Frank said. The FBI is examining her involvement in the document fraud and the guardianship petition. Her bar association has been notified. He paused. She cooperated. She told them things. About Marcus. About Dale Pruitt. About the loan. About who arranged the surveillance and when it started. He looked at the display cases for a moment. At the pianos inside. The restored instruments, the antique uprights, the small spinet Elise had been working on since October. She understood which way things were moving, he said. And she made a calculation. Thomas Whitfield called at 7:40. He said the emergency asset freeze petition had been filed with the Vermont Circuit Court at 7 that morning, and a duty judge had granted the temporary order within 20 minutes, which Thomas described as unusually fast, but not surprising given the federal arrest. Marcus's known assets, 2 bank accounts, a leased vehicle, and a partial interest in a Burlington commercial property, were now frozen pending resolution of the debt claim. Thomas estimated the full recovery would take several months, with some portion of the judgment likely remaining unsatisfied, given the gap between Marcus's available assets and the $1.8 million claim. Elise's trust is untouched, he said. The patent proceeds. The trust structure. All of it. Exactly as she designed it. I thanked him, and hung up and stood in the shop for a while, without doing anything in particular. Outside, the last morning of December was coming in gray and cold off the Vermont coast, the way winter mornings came in this part of the country, indifferent to calendars and arrests, and the quiet machinery of consequences finally arriving at the doors they had been built to reach. Elise came downstairs at 8. She was dressed, which meant she had been awake for some time. She came into the shop through the connecting door and stopped. She did not see my face. She listened to it, to the particular quality of the silence I was carrying, and she understood immediately, the way she always did. I told her everything. I told her about the arrest, the charges, the asset freeze, Diane's cooperation, Thomas's call. I told her in the order it had happened, without editorializing, the way I would describe the sequence of a repair. This happened. Then this. Then this. She stood on the customer side of the display cases and listened without interrupting. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was very still. When I finished, she did not say anything for a long moment. She turned her head toward the display case beside her. Inside it were the instruments I had collected and restored over the years. Small uprights, a melodeon, a portable harmonium with ivory keys. And in the front row, placed where anyone walking into the shop would see it first, the little spinet piano Elise had spent 3 months restoring. She had replaced every hammer, restrung the entire instrument, repaired a crack in the soundboard with a splice so clean I had to use a magnifying glass to find it. I had placed it in the front of the case the week before, because it deserved to be seen. She stood facing the case for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor, not the way someone sits when they are tired or unwell. She simply folded herself down until she was sitting on the wooden floor of the shop, with her back against the display case, her knees drawn up, and her face in her hands. It was not collapse. It was arrival. The arrival of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally reached the place where she was allowed to set it down. I came around the counter and sat down on the floor beside her. There was nothing else to do. We stayed like that for a while. The shop was quiet. The pianos on the walls and in the cases held their silence. The strings resting under tension the way they always did. The hammers poised above the strings the way they always were. Everything waiting and nothing moving. The whole room suspended in the particular stillness of instruments that had been tuned and were simply ready. After a few minutes, Elise lowered her hands. Her eyes were dry, which did not surprise me. I had seen her cry once, at Sarah's funeral, and she had done it the way she did most things. Quietly, completely, and without asking anyone to notice. I kept thinking, she said, that if I did everything right, it would feel like something. I did not ask her what she meant. I understood what she meant. Does it? I asked. She turned her head toward the display case, toward the spinet she had restored, with its replaced hammers and its repaired soundboard and its new tuning pins that she had set herself, one at a time, by feel. It feels like finishing a tuning, she said. You bring every string into alignment, and the instrument sounds right, and you know it is right. But the piano does not know you fixed it. It just plays. I put my arm around her, and she leaned against my shoulder. Her head fit against the side of my neck the way it had when she was small, when the shop was dark, and I would carry her upstairs after she fell asleep at the workbench. She was too old for that now, but she was not too old for this. Frank found us there when he came back at 9. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. And then he stepped inside and sat down on the floor on Elise's other side without saying a word. He was 66 years old, and it clearly took effort. But he did it without complaint and without making it about himself. The three of us sat against the display case while the morning light shifted across the floor and the pianos held their tuning, and nobody felt the need to say anything at all for quite some time. It was not the silence of things being hidden. It was the silence of things being finished. And it was, I think, the first honest silence that shop had known in months. January came in the way quiet comes after the last note of a long piece has faded. Not suddenly, but with the particular relief of a tension that has finally released. The shop reopened on the 2nd. I tuned a church piano for a woman who had played it for 40 years. I replaced a broken hammer in a practice upright a college student had carried across 2 state lines in the back of a truck. The work was the same work it had always been, and I was grateful for it in a way I had not been before. The way you become grateful for the ordinary texture of a day after a period when ordinary days were not available. Thomas called on January 8th. The federal grand jury had returned the indictment. 6 counts: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, second-degree burglary, first-degree forgery, and a 6th count related to the false representations in the guardianship petition. The homicide charge was being handled separately by the Vermont State Prosecutor's Office in coordination with the FBI, with a filing expected in late February. Marcus remained in custody. His bail had been denied on grounds of flight risk. Diane's law license had been placed on administrative suspension. Dale Pruitt had been charged with stalking and conspiracy to intimidate a witness. He had entered a not guilty plea. Frank said the evidence against him was, in his words, not favorable to the defense. Thomas called again in early February. The civil asset liquidation had begun. Marcus's accounts held enough to cover roughly 40% of the judgment. The rest would take months. Thomas said Elise should not expect full recovery. When I told her, she said she had not expected it. She said she had bought the debt at 60 cents on the dollar because she had wanted the legal mechanism, not the money. Thomas, when I relayed this, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell her She should consider law school, I told her. She considered it for approximately 2 seconds and said she was going to be an acoustic engineer, but that she appreciated the thought. Through all of this, Elise went back to school. Her teachers noted in the mid-year review that her work was excellent and that she seemed, in the words of her English teacher, unusually self-possessed for her age. I read that phrase several times. I was not sure it captured what I knew of her, but I understood what the teacher meant. And I did not disagree. One afternoon in late January, I found her in the back of the shop, not working. Just sitting on the stool by the window that looked out at the alley and the narrow strip of gray sky above the neighboring building. She had her notebook open on her lap, but she was not writing in it. "I have been thinking about Mom," she said. Not about what happened, just about her. The way she laughed at things before anyone else in the room realized they were funny. She paused. "I have not let myself think about that in a long time." She looked down at the notebook and drew something small in the margin. Not a diagram, not a schematic. A bird. 4 quick lines, simple and unhesitating. Then she turned the page. "I think I am going to be all right," she said. It came out as an observation rather than a reassurance. The way she stated things she had verified and found to be true. "I know you are," I said. On the last Friday of January, Frank came by with a bottle of Vermont, cider, and 3 glasses. We sat in the back room after closing and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. Frank told a story about a case from 1989 involving a stolen tractor and a misidentified set of boot prints. Elise laughed at the right moments. I sat at the bench and listened and thought about the word ordinary and how it was, when you had been without it for a while, one of the finest words in the language. The homicide indictment came on the 26th of February. Thomas called at noon. The Vermont State Prosecutor's Office, working in coordination with the FBI, had filed a formal indictment against Marcus Calloway on 1 count of murder in the 2nd degree, charging that he had administered a synthetic histamine compound to Sarah Calloway in the 36 to 48 hours preceding her death. A 2nd count of conspiracy to commit murder had been filed jointly against Marcus and Dale Pruitt, based on phone records connecting them during the period of the poisoning. I was at the workbench when Thomas told me. I set the tuning lever down on the cloth before I spoke. He said the trial would likely come in autumn. He said the civil proceedings continued on their own track. He said Sarah Calloway's name was now in the public record, not as a footnote, but as the reason the case existed at all. Elise came home at 3:30. I had set out 2 cups of coffee, which she understood by now as a signal. She sat across from me, and I told her everything. The charge, the conspiracy count, the timeline, what Thomas had said about Sarah's name in the record. She listened without moving. When I finished, she said, "2nd degree. That means they believe it was intentional, but may not prove premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt." Thomas said the same thing, I said. She was quiet. Outside, the February light came off the lake with a flat, patient quality I had lived alongside for decades and still found beautiful on certain days. "She called me that morning," Elise said. She had told me this before, weeks ago with Frank, but this time she said it differently. Without the careful flatness she used when reporting facts, this time it sounded like what it was. She said she had found what she needed. She was going to see a lawyer that afternoon. Elise stopped. She did not sound frightened. She sounded settled, like someone who had made a decision and was not going back on it. A pause. She always got quiet like that when she knew exactly what she was going to do. She always had a plan. I did not respond. Some things do not need a response. They need only to be said and heard. After a while, she picked up her coffee and held it in both hands. "Will you be all right?" she asked. "Through the trial?" "Yes," I said. "Will you?" "Yes." Then, after a moment, "I think Mom would have liked knowing it went this far, that someone kept going." I went to the shelf above the workbench and picked up the silver tuning fork I had carried for 50 years. An A440. stamped by a German manufacturer in 1974, the year I began my apprenticeship. I brought it to the table and set it in front of her. She picked it up with both hands. The careful grip she used for instruments she intended to understand fully. She turned it over, felt its weight, ran her thumb along the tines. "Why this one?" she asked. "Because of what it does," I said. "You strike it once, and it gives you the truth. A single, clear note. No compromise, no approximation." I looked at her. "You have always known the truth, Elise. Even when I was not ready to hear it." She struck the fork once against the edge of the table. The note rang out, pure and absolute, filling the kitchen with a single unwavering frequency. A 440. The pitch every orchestra in the world tunes to. The one note that does not negotiate. We listened together as it faded. Not into silence, but into the kind of quiet that still holds the shape of what was just there. She put the tuning fork in her pocket, walked to the showroom, sat down at the Steinway, and opened the fallboard. She placed her hands on the keys, and she played. It was a piece I had never heard. Something she had written herself, with a melody that moved the way water moves over stones, finding its way around every obstacle without stopping. She did not tell me who it was for. She did not need to. I stood in the doorway and listened. And I understood that this was for Sarah. For the woman who had asked whether a piano knows when it is in tune, and answered her own question by saying she would know for it. For the mother who had called her daughter on the last morning of her life, and sounded not frightened but settled. For the person who always had a plan, even when the plan was simply to get her child to safety before the time ran out. I cried. For the first time in 6 years, standing in the doorway of my own shop, I cried. Not because I was sad, because I had finally heard. Because after 6 years of refusing to listen, I had let the note in, and it found every part of me that needed to hear it. I am 71 years old. I stayed silent too long, chose comfort over truth too many times. If these grandpa stories teach anything, do not wait the way I waited. Do not let silence become a decision you never meant to make. I believe God places certain people in our lives not to protect us from pain, but to show us what courage looks like up close. Elise showed me that. I believe God gave Sarah the strength to drive through the rain that night and bring her daughter to the one place she knew was safe. And I believe, with the faith of a man who has spent 50 years listening for truth inside broken instruments, that God does not waste a single note, not even the ones we play too late. Every family has a version of Marcus, someone who mistakes love for ownership and money for power. No patent, no trust fund, no fortune is worth what we lose when we stop protecting each other. These stories are not comfortable, but they are honest. And every honest family story is worth more than a perfect one. If something here stayed with you, leave a comment. I read every one. Share this with someone who needs it. And if you want to stay for more grandpa stories, you are always welcome here. The shop was quiet. The tuning fork was in Elise's pocket. The Steinway was closed. Outside, the Vermont night came in off the lake, cold and dark. And the street was empty. And the pianos held their silence the way they always did after the last note had been played. That is where it ended. Not with a verdict. That would come later. But with a tuning fork in a pocket, and a girl asleep upstairs who had played a song for her mother on a piano that remembered everything, and the particular stillness of a night in which the dangerous thing was over. And the long, ordinary, unscheduled rest of it was still waiting to be lived. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built for honest human purposes. If that is not for you, no obligation. But if you are still here, welcome.